Tonight on Reporting Scotland, the SNP set out a new economic blueprint for independence, including plans to keep the pound for at least 10 years. Good evening. The SNP's published a new blueprint for independence. The report from the party's Growth Commission spotlights a drive to attract more migrants to Scotland and promises to keep the pound for at least 10 years after independence. Nicola Sturgeon says the plan would help Scotland to thrive, matching the economic performance of other small countries. Her rivals say it's a recipe for spending cuts and should be dumped. This from our political editor, Brian Taylor.
The task: to fill gaps in the independence offer on economic growth, on public spending and, crucially, on the currency.
Andrew, how are you doing? This morning?
The man charged with that task, former Nationalist MSP Andrew Wilson. He argues that an independent Scotland would be nimble enough to match the economic dynamism of other small countries.
We've got all that it takes. The question is, have we got ambition for ourselves? Do we have a plan? Do we have a strategy? Have we been honest about the challenges? And I think the report tries to do all of those things. It's not the last word, Brian. Other people will have other ideas. I'm sure that people will disagree on some of the aspects of it, but we think it's an honest, workable, deliverable solution, and it's really ambitious, but we can do it.
On the currency, the report says keep the pound for at least 10 years and only consider a Scottish currency if and when the economy improves. The report argues for competitive business taxes, but not the previous plan for a 3% cut in corporation tax. It urges a new focus on export growth, and it says the big driver for the economy would be population growth. That involves financial incentives to bring students and graduates here from other countries, arguing their skills boost the economy. The aim: to push the population above 6 million. 4 years ago, referendum defeat left Nicola Sturgeon pondering. Since then, much has changed. North Sea oil revenues are below the forecasts used by the SNP, although today's report says Scotland remains energy rich and could divert cash to a fund for future generations. Above all, Brexit awaits. A real challenge, but, says the First Minister, also an opportunity to change direction.
Change is inevitable given Brexit. There is no status quo anymore. This is a debate about how we maximise Scotland's potential rather than just getting stuck in the despairing Brexit path that we know will make all of us poorer.
But Ruth Davidson says, why pile uncertainty upon uncertainty? She says people don't want to revisit independence.
Rather than the grandstanding we've had today from the First Minister, I think the people of Scotland just want her to go back to the day job of improving school standards and fixing our hospitals. But, this doesn't answer any of the questions that were raised even 4 years ago.
Today's report says Scotland would make an annual solidarity payment of around £5 billion to the rest of the UK to cover commitments on debt and international aid. It envisages a cut in defence spending as inherited plans come under review, and it wants to trim Scotland's deficit below 3% of economic output. Labour say that could mean tough times for Scotland.
It's billed as a Growth Commission report, but actually the prospectus it offers is a Cuts Commission report, and it's one which sees a fairly bleak future in that it is talking in depth about substantial cuts to public expenditure.
Nicola Sturgeon enthusiastically joins in, welcoming the big noise to Holyrood, young musicians from deprived areas of Scotland. Looking on, the author of today's report. Both say an independent Scotland would boost wealth and spread it around more fairly. Rivals, as ever, dissent.
Well, as Brian was saying, the Sustainable Growth Commission recommends that an independent Scotland keeps the pound for at least 10 years before a possible switch to a separate Scottish currency. But they've dropped the idea of a formal currency union with the rest of the UK. Our political correspondent Glenn Campbell has taken the currency question to Inverclyde.
No matter where you shop or what you buy...
How much is it? £1.80, please. £1.80, here we are.
You need cold, hard currency to pay. But what currency would folk here in Inverclyde want Scotland to choose if there was a yes vote in a future independence referendum?
I think euros, just to be in line with other countries, and for the economies and for travelling about in different countries and things like that.
I think it's an unnecessary complication to think of another currency. All the the repricing, the cost of producing new currency or whatever. So.
And you'd stick to the pound as well?
I think so, yeah, if we could. If the Bank of England lets us.
Poonam Gupta's paper business trades around the world in all major currencies, but at home she'd prefer to stick with sterling.
I would basically say that if we actually go independent, then we need to look at a currency union if we want to stay with the pound. So we actually have some say in the financial policies for the United Kingdom.
But what if the UK says, no, we don't want to share?
Well, guys, don't say no. If you're going to go independent, just remember we've been with you for 300 years. We deserve some love from that point of view.
But in the 2014 vote, the UK government spurned the Scottish government's proposal for a formal currency union.
People need to know that is not going to happen.
People can see through scaremongering when they hear it. And an example of that, of course, is the bluff and bluster of people like Ed Balls and George Osborne on sterling.
So if there's another vote, the SNP Growth Commission recommends an independent Scotland keeps using the pound and sticks with the rules of the Bank of England anyway, without a formal agreement. And that way, they say, the UK government wouldn't have a veto. Using the pound would be a bridging position for at least 10 years before an independent Scotland might adopt a separate currency. But the report says that should only happen if 6 tests are met, including the new state successfully managing public finances, establishing a credible central bank, and winning public and business support for a new currency. Before then, we'd keep using the pound informally. But that's not uncontroversial.
I think you can anticipate that within the Yes camp there will be those who are saying this isn't independence, this isn't independent enough, and meanwhile of course there'll be those on the other side saying, well look, actually no country at least as big as Scotland has ever gone down this track of using somebody else's currency, and that therefore this is a very untried and untested proposition.
A proposition that's yet to become SNP policy before being put to the public in a future referendum that still seems some way distant. Glenn Campbell reporting Scotland, Gourock.
Our business and economy editor Douglas Fraser is with me now. I mean, we were reminded in Glenn's report just how central the economy has been to the debate about independence in Scotland. To what extent does this report move the argument on?
Well, it clearly moves. It's 4 years. It's clearly moving things on from 4 years ago. After very little had changed in terms of the arguments we've been hearing, it's candid, more so than in 2014, about the costs and the risks, particularly of the transition to independence, and also the compromises longer term. You're hearing there about currency, Scotland having no influence, let alone control over interest rates and financial management, and also having to cut back the deficit with some really tough constraints being recommended here on spending for at least 10 years. Now, it tries to avoid the easy answers, which we sometimes hear, admits that economic growth is not going to take off. It's not on its own the answer. Immigration is vital. That's far from popular with some people. It puts future oil revenues to one side rather than using them to close the gap on the deficit. It points to the need to make much clearer choices between priorities rather than just adding up all the demands. Now, in both economic and political terms, it's about reassurance, it's about building credibility, and in the context of the Brexit process, the reassurance and the credibility of Scotland within the UK is facing a fairly threatening time.
Thanks very much, Douglas Fraser. Back now for a quick word to our political editor, Brian Taylor at Holyrood. Is this report, is this throwing down a gauntlet, Brian, to the SNP's opponents?
Sally, it's about policy, of course. It's about policy on independence and concomitant matters like the currency, but it's also about strategy. Nicola Sturgeon is trying, first of all, to enthuse her own activists, to give them something to evangelise, to allow those activists, if you like, to be active rather than fretting and festering, but she's also trying to entice her opponents, her rivals, onto her own territory, to talk about the details of independence back and forward, to talk about the why of independence rather than the how and the when. As to the question of when, the report is deliberately silent
on the subject of timing, and Nicola Sturgeon herself would say no more than she will make up her mind as to whether to hold an independence referendum once Brexit is perhaps clearer. On that very same point, Ruth Davidson was asked would she give advice to the Prime Minister on whether to permit that referendum to take place. She said that advice hadn't changed. She would still say the Prime Minister should say no.
Brian, thank you very much.